The Oldest View is a found footage style horror series made by the incredibly talented Kane Pixels, which tells a story mostly from the perspective of a vlogger called Wyatt, and honestly, it's even scarier than the Backrooms, because this series managed to make me feel a fear that I haven't experienced since watching my very first ever analog horror, which I find utterly horrifying, by the way, so I think that just goes to show how bad The Oldest View gets. And in this video, I'll be talking about all of the current episodes of The Oldest View, going in order, of course, which means I'll first be talking about Episode 1, Renewal. Which, if I'm being honest, makes very little sense to me, because le brain's smooth, so I went and looked at the wiki page, which will tell you that the man in the video is called Julian Revachon, and this guy is in black and white, which is in contrast to his very green surroundings, and until making this video, I knew very little of Mr. Revachon, so I did some research. And in doing so, I learned that Revachon was a botanist, which would explain why he gets a little intimate with a flower at the beginning of the video, but that's not really important. What is, however, happens a bit later on in the video, as we see a man who we can believe to be Kevin O'Bregan making a mask before the first episode comes to a close. And what a great episode it was, because I don't think that I've seen a series that has used real people in its story like this to such a great effect, because these aren't some really infamous or famous historical figures. These are people that you've likely never heard of, and the same applied to me. I had no idea who Julian Revachon or Kevin O'Bregan were before this, and I think that adds a whole other layer of mystery to it, and allows us to get more immersed into the story than if they were just random people made up for the sake of the series. So overall, brilliant first episode. Although there's nothing really scary about the first episode, except for maybe the weird music that plays whilst the mask is being made, but that's fine, because the first episode doesn't need to be scary. After all, it's set up, so that makes sense, but if you thought that it was going to stay like that, you would be dead wrong, as it doesn't. In fact, the second episode is so much worse, so why don't we just move on and talk about episode 2, Beneath the Earth. Which starts with a slow pan away from what looks to be some trees, whilst we hear a very subtle noise that sounds like the wheels on a skateboard, but that'll be more important later, as we now cut to a vlogger who I mentioned prior, but in case you've got his name, it's Wyatt, and he's a naughty boy because he is making a video of him trespassing on private land, as he's found something very interesting that just so happens to be a random staircase leading deep into the earth. And already that's strange, but it's made even worse by the sickly yellow lighting that reminded me of level 0 of the Backrooms, and the fact that it becomes hard to tell up from down whilst looking at this staircase isn't fun. In fact, it's really trippy. But before I go any further, I just have to say how incredible Kane Pixels is at Blender, because I've tried to learn how to use Blender, and if I'm being honest, it's going slow. But even though I am nowhere near Kane Pixels' level, I can see the level of skill you need to do something like this. And I have to give it up because it's absolutely incredible. But back to the episode, as Wyatt continues down the stairs until he reaches the bottom, where distorted music can be heard from afar, but that's not important right now, as at the bottom of the stairs we see a tattered door surrounded by rusted tile walls, which ups the fear factor quite a bit, because the rusty tiles and tattered door represent time, I think, and how it's affected these things, to the point where they're absolutely disgusting. So obviously, no one's taking care of them, they've just been left to rot, which is strange because after passing through this door and the rusted room behind it, Wyatt finds himself in a mall store devoid of life that doesn't show any real signs of decay, which is so strange because we've literally just seen a whole room covered in rust and dirt, so why should this room be any different? And also, why is there a mall this deep into the earth? Well, in my opinion, I think that the stairs and the room at the very bottom of them are a transitional zone between worlds, as one can be affected by time whilst the other stays stuck in the past, but that is about where episode 2 ends, as Wyatt isn't quite ready to explore an entire underground mall all by himself, so he leaves and comes back next episode. So overall, Wyatt isn't very smart because this idiot found an underground staircase that leads to a mall deep underground and had the chance to leave and never return, but hey, click-through rate is very pleasing, so I can sort of understand the motivation for returning, but still, it's really stupid, so that's why I have come to the conclusion that Wyatt is a dumbass. But either way, it's time for me to talk about episode 3, The Rolling Giant. Which is over 40 minutes long, so we have a lot to discuss, and trust me when I say that this episode is absolutely terrifying, because this is the first episode where an actual enemy is introduced. But before all that, let's talk about the beginning of the video, which starts with the same rolling sound from the last video, before cutting to Wyatt again, who explains how he set up trail cameras near the stairs that he got from his botany professor, so that he can keep an eye on the hole and see if anything changes before he goes back in. But the only thing that's really changed is the fact that one of the lights has gone out on the stairs, so nothing big enough to deter Wyatt, which is why he goes straight in this time, but you can tell he's nervous, although he's still far too brave, because when he gets to the bottom this time, he enters the mall itself, which is actually very interesting because this isn't just any old mall. In fact, this mall is called Midtown Valley View Mall, which was a real place that Kane Pixels has replicated for this series using the actual blueprints of the place, I believe. And I think that adds to the fear factor even more, because making it a real place allows it to mess with our heads in a way that imaginary location can't. So I think that's really interesting, and the fact that he used real blueprints to make it is even more impressive. But enough about that, because I want to get back to the very dangerous exploring with Wyatt, because after a little bit of time, we eventually see a sign that mentions a puppet show, specifically oversized puppets, a rolling giant even, and right after seeing this, there he is, the Rolling Giant. And antagonist of this episode, who was based on Julian Revachon and was made by Kevin O'Bregan. So the two people from the first episode finally have significance again, but upon seeing this, the lights begin to turn on in the mall, and music begins to play. So naturally, Wyatt walks towards the light, away from the giant. However, Wyatt has had just about enough for one day, so he runs back to the staircase so he can go home, but seeing as episode 3 still has about 25 minutes left before it's done, he ain't leaving. In fact, he can't, because the staircase is completely filled in with rubble, just completely out of nowhere as well. Like, if this happened, I'm sure that Wyatt would have been able to hear it, but what I really want to focus on here is the fact that this is absolutely horrifying, not just because he's blocked in and basically has zero ways of reaching the surface at the moment, but because we, unlike Wyatt, have common sense enough to know that he ain't alone down there. In fact, he's stuck down there with one big old Julian Revachon, but Julian's playing the slow game right now, which gives Wyatt plenty of time to wander around the mall and see what else this place has to offer. But if you ask me, the most interesting thing this mall has to offer is the weird sort of forest-looking thing that actually looks like it's from the outside. But again, how could that be possible? Because Wyatt is clearly nowhere near the surface, so the fact that there is a forest down here means it's either not real or Wyatt's just really in hell or something. But after seeing that, things go to shit very quickly, because right before Wyatt sees this forest, we actually find out that the giant is on the move, as we first see him in front of an octopus mural, which is completely different to where he is when we next see him. So he's obviously on the move, but he isn't actually aggressive until after Wyatt sees this forest, because after that we see him appear right behind Wyatt, and anytime he turns around, the giant moves closer, so kind of like the Weeping Angels from Doctor Who, which if I'm being honest, I never really found scary, possibly because I didn't watch Doctor Who as a kid. But the giant, however, is a completely different story, because one, his design is nightmarish, and two, this guy can move when being looked at. He's just taunting Wyatt, which makes him far more scary than a weeping angel, but sadly, the giant is beaten by Wyatt because Wyatt takes advantage of its biggest weakness: escalators. So the giant goes in the other direction, which for some reason gives Wyatt the brilliant idea of running back down the escalator so that he can run in the opposite direction of the giant. And spoiler alert, it didn't work, because the giant instantly made a 180 and began hunting Wyatt down again like a pit bull to a 4-year-old child. But unluckily for the giant, Wyatt unlocks his inner strength so that he can break down a wooden pallet blocking one of the stores in the mall. And in doing so, he's given access to the offices in the back of the mall. And these offices have some very special information hidden in them, such as a map of the building that details where the exit is. So Wyatt sets out to get there, but when Wyatt goes back into the main part of the mall again, it's completely deteriorated. Which is just so strange, because Wyatt wasn't even in the offices for long, so obviously something's not right, but that's fine. As long as Wyatt can get to the AMC where the exit is, he'll be fine. But upon getting to the escalator, everybody's favourite giant returns to chase after Wyatt again, which leads Wyatt to run all the way to the other escalator, and whilst running we see all of the other giant puppets from the parade. Only for about a second though, as Wyatt is not wasting any time whatsoever, and luckily for him, there's a rooftop exit right next to him. But unluckily for him, the giant has overcome their biggest weakness and begins to go up the escalator, which means poor Wyatt is completely cornered, which leads him to scream at the giant, asking what he wants, and the giant answers by showing Wyatt a dead horse and a few dead humans as well, before charging straight at Wyatt. And turns out the giant is pretty heavy because he does a lot of damage to the walls near Wyatt, but not Wyatt himself, because that boy is now on the roof and ready to escape, which he actually might do, because he manages to get to a set of stairs, but right before he can begin walking up them, the floor gives out from beneath his feet, sending him straight to his death, and while falling, he lets out one of the most blood-curdling screams I have ever heard, and the next thing we see of Wyatt is him lying in the grass above ground. And the next thing we see is Wyatt lying in the grass above ground in black and white, just like Julian Revachon from the first episode, while the giant watches him from the bushes. And that's how the episode ends, and if I'm being honest, I don't really understand this series all too well, but I would like to try and theorize anyway. So in my opinion, Wyatt is an anomaly in the mall, because I think that the mall is supposed to be a place that's unaffected by time or humans, so when Wyatt enters the mall, it begins to decay. So the giant, who I believe to be a sort of security system that's in charge of the mall, is trying to get rid of Wyatt so that the mall doesn't continue to decay. And I think that the giant may represent the decay, so he's the one who controls it, but I'm really unsure about that one. However, that is about all there is to my theory right now, as I really have no idea where the series will go from here, because unlike the Backrooms found footage, this series' basis isn't something that's already wildly popular online. It's just based off some people that most have never even heard of, and some obscure images that Kane Pixels found on the internet, so really, I can't predict what will come next. All I can do is try to make sense out of what we've seen so far, but if I were to guess what's going to happen next, I'd assume it would be something like Wyatt's body being found or something, but again, I have no clue where this will end up going, and we likely won't get more from the oldest view for a while, because I know that Kane Pixels is actually going to be spending a lot of time from now on working on the Backrooms movie with A24, which I'm really hyped for, but let's actually talk a bit more about the oldest view, and I don't mean theories, I just want to talk a bit more in depth about some things that I really like about this series. For example, the giant itself, which is real in case I haven't already mentioned that. So this thing was out there at one point, which adds to the fear factor tenfold, and even if it didn't have the supernatural abilities it does in the oldest view, that doesn't make it any less scary, which is why it's even worse when you give it supernatural supernatural abilities, and a whole ton of bloodlust. But the thing I respect most about Kane Pixels using the Giant as his antagonist for the 3rd episode is that the Giant is very obscure, and while Wendigoon, or as he's now known, Iceberg Boy, was reacting to the oldest view with Alex Kister, the creator of the Mandela Catalogue, and Kane Pixels himself, Kane Pixels revealed the amount of time it took to find stuff about the Giant, and honestly, I would have broke if I had to do that level of research. So massive props to him. And I also want to mention one particular moment in episode 3 when we see the staircase blocked by rubble, because that scene is absolutely crushing. And I did say a little bit about it earlier, but it's absolutely horrifying when we hear Wyatt's voice just full of pure despair. So overall, just utterly terrifying. But that is about all that I want to say for the oldest view, which is just so incredible from start to finish, and I've really never seen something quite like it. So I urge everyone who's watched this video to go and watch the oldest view, which will be linked in the description. But either way, that is the end of the video, so if you have enjoyed, please make sure to subscribe, smash that like button, and leave a comment down below, because we are aiming for 500 subs by the end of the year, and any help in that goal would be much appreciated. So just do it, because I'll love you forever and ever. But with that all said and done, that is the end of the video, so goodbye to you lovely, lovely people.